Welcome to Full Press, a media criticism podcast from The Hub, where listeners and readers can escape the media echo chambers for precious 40 minutes every 2 weeks, released on Thursdays. As always, I'm Harrison Lowman, managing editor of The Hub, and today I am joined by my co-hosts Tara Henley and Peter Menzies. How are you doing today?
Well,
Great.
thanks.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to get right into it today. Here's a little taste. We'll try to understand how two journalists can look at the same protest. One can write down peaceful, and the other can pick up their notepad and write hellscape. We will look at who owns the Maple Leaf. In the lead up to Canada Day, a CBC story seems to imply that there's one sort of Canadian and not a multitude. And a call for more journalism subsidies. Comrade Menzies here is not pleased, and he will be voicing his displeasure in the next few minutes. But first, let's look at the immigration raids down south. Trump pushing to find undocumented workers, people who are illegally, his government targeting work sites, farms, clubs, even restaurants, ignited massive protests in downtown Los Angeles. I'll put up a picture behind me. And in the nearby suburbs. Trump then deploys some 4,000 members of the National Guard, 700 Marines to address this. He says he needs to safeguard federal property and agents. Governor Gavin Newsom comes out, and the mayor of LA comes out and says, you're manufacturing a crisis. You're distracting from your feud with Elon Musk. You're picking on the vulnerable. A curfew is brought in. Protesters are accused of throwing rocks and bottles and fireworks at police officers. They're looting stores. There's a lot of vandalism. But, there's a different story here. Mainstream media portrays these protests as relatively peaceful. They talk about isolated incidents of the violence I've just described, words like orderly. But journalists on the right describe a violent insurrection with violent riots and chaos. Tara, start this off for us. How the heck do you get that disconnect when you're essentially looking at the same thing, but, a different article comes out the pipeline?
Yeah, it's really, I think, an indication of how polarized the US media has become. And I think it's to the detriment of the public. It's very difficult to figure out what is going on. And really, what you're forced to do is to look at the left-leaning press and look at the right-leaning press and try to piece together the story for yourself. For me, I think it is very reminiscent of some of the protests that we saw in 2020 in terms of the left-leaning media's coverage of those protests. You had Brian Stelter saying that the unrest is isolated. This is of the LA riots. You had an ABC anchor in LA saying that it was just a bunch of people having fun watching cars burn. So to try to get a better idea of what's going on, I went to the work of Leighton Woodhouse, who's an independent journalist. I think he's an interesting observer as he is a left-leaning journalist, but who is independent. And his reporting was quite telling. He was on the ground. He was watching protesters throw rocks down at police cars. He saw a police car's window smashed by that. He pointed out or had another protester point out to him that these rocks were big enough to kill somebody. This is quite serious situation. And he said that, as someone who had covered a lot of mass protests, that this was a uniquely volatile and combustible incidents. So I think we do pay attention to that. Of course, we always bring our skepticism to the reporting. We try to look at as many sources as possible, but it seems to me that this is reminiscent of what we saw in 2020 when we saw that famous chyron on CNN saying mostly peaceful protests with a car burning in the background.
I have the picture of it right here, Amal, if you want to show. This is what, set people off, specifically on the right. With the reporter describing things with I think you could describe that as a hellscape behind him. Peter, are we entering a world where journalists on the right are kind of anti-protest because they want order and stability, and journalists on the left want to, pardon my French, burn shit to the ground, upend systems, so, report favorably on these things and try to sort of gloss over the nasty bits? What do you think?
I think it depends on their preconceptions and probably their assignment. Covering protests can be very complicated, particularly ones the size of this, because, to be fair to the image we just showed, He could be correct. It could be mostly peaceful. There's just this one car burning that happens to be beside me. Now,
I
that's
think it was
not
a car
a
park
very
there.
good way to frame the shot, for sure. But I mean, the reporter can only be where the reporter can be. 2 blocks over, there could all hell could be breaking loose, and it could be peaceful where the reporter is, or you could be where all hell is breaking loose, and the other, 5 acres of protest area is fine. I think a lot of it though comes down to when the reporter heads out to do the story, what their assignment editor is telling them to get, right? Okay, get if there's burning, I want images of burning, right? Like I want stuff that catches eyeballs and that sort of stuff, and then you get that distortion. And plus, as Tara was saying, you have this U.S. And in Canada too, to some extent, media framework where the world is made up of good guys and bad guys.
Yeah.
And depending, if Fox News is reporting and it's people who are not Fox News viewers watching, they're talking about bad guys because that's the way their audience wants to view the world too, perhaps.
Yeah.
And vice versa. It's not healthy. It's not great journalism. Although the journalism is difficult to execute on in matters of this scale.
I would say, talking about great journalism, and I've been asked this by some younger journalists, it's like, okay, what should I be looking for when I go to this event? I'm like, let the event dictate what you find, right? Like,
Exactly.
you should
Yeah.
not
Yes.
be going there with preconceived notions. Go there, tell me what you see, and then and back it up by speaking to people, and then let's sort of describe your story. As always with a lot of these things, not just about immigration raids, right? These things become about racism, socialism. There's pro-Palestine folks at these protests. Tara, who speaks for the protesters? Like when imagine you're that reporter I've sent to this protest. How can one person with all these different groups, this like smorgasbord of people, pretend to speak on behalf of all of them? Or, some are more organized. Maybe there are actual leaders there. How do you navigate through that?
I think it's extremely tricky because I think as a reporter on the scene, your instinct is to get the most newsworthy thing that you can. And sometimes that newsworthy thing is just not representative of the group. So I think about this, for example, with the trucker protests. We saw some outrageous videos coming out of those protests, but it does seem in retrospect that those were very isolated, that was not the vast majority of those protesters. You also saw it at the pro-Palestinian encampment at U of T. I saw all kinds of videos online of really quite extreme statements. And I personally went and walked around there, and that's not what I was seeing on the ground at that particular moment. So again, it's as Peter says, it's what's happening in that moment, and you have to recognize that. But I do think there's an instinct on the part of journalists to seek out the kind of the most outrageous, and that is we need to remember that's not representative of most crowds.
Mm-hmm. I remember going to the. Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
No, I was going to say like that can be what happens. I just dig around and you talk to this guy, you talk to this guy, and talk to this guy, and hey, I just found a guy who said this about Harrison Lowman. Wow, I'm going to run with that, right? That'll get my clicks or whatever, and that's irresponsible because you can include that, but you've got to say, well, put it in context.
At the same time, if you're leading these protests and there is some sort of organization behind it, it's on you to a certain extent to control them. If they're getting completely out of hand. I remember going to the G20 just as I just wanted to see what the heck was going on. It was absolutely wild. Obviously, the police went overboard. We saw this play out in the courts and the payments made to people who had basically been detained in pens here in Toronto. There were real protesters, and then there were absolute shit disturbers. I remember a guy coming up to me without his shirt on with star tattoos on both nipples, which were pierced, and he said to me, "Have you ever felt pepper spray?" Like he was excited to be pepper sprayed because he wanted like a thrill. Maybe he was a part of this. I don't know if you guys remember the Black Bloc, this like violent anarchist group who were just going around smashing windows along the streets here. So you get all types. This quote from, I believe, the article you're referencing in the Free Press, Tara. "Who needs the red carpet in L.A. when you can strut down the Pacific Coast Highway dodging pepper spray balls and the National Guard?" Just finally, before we move on, though, there were journalists that have been hurt, right? Like A few of them have
Yes.
been shot by rubber bullets. Because you want that shot, Peter, you often get caught in the fray. And some journalists allege that they had been intentionally shot. Reporters Without Borders says they condemned what they described as an indiscriminate wave of violence against journalists who they said are exercising their First Amendment rights for the press to cover the raids. And they quote some 40 attacks since the protest began, one during a live broadcast. And this is both from police and protesters. Tara, what do you make of that, and how journalists sort of handle the fact that being in the front lines means you often get caught up in the mix of things?
I think it is an occupational hazard, and one that we have to take pretty seriously, but not to allow that to deter us from going into these demonstrations. We saw that again with the trucker crisis. There were a lot of reporters that were very reluctant and hesitant to go into the demonstrations, and I think the reporting really suffered for it. Yeah, there was notable exceptions: David Common at CBC, Jamie Poisson at CBC, Evan Solomon at CTV, now of course a Liberal MP, and Rupa Subramanya. But you cannot allow that to deter you from actually going to these events and seeing what is going on in the ground, on the ground.
Peter, what do you think?
I think that we are poorly served by journalists who succumb to their fears. Being afraid is fine, and taking measures to make yourself feel secure is fine too. But not going to find the story. We need people to do that. That said, I mean, I watched that clip several times of the Australian reporter getting hit by the rubber bullet, and the police officer, in my takeaway from it, took aim, and fired that rubber bullet, in her direction. And I thought that was outrageous. That was just an example of, I think, panicked and poor policing. That the reporter was doing her job. She was clearly identified. She was surrounded by crew and that sort of stuff. And that's always just that's. I mean, that's why reporters get afraid to go in, right? But I didn't like that. I thought we should stick up for journalists who have the courage to go into the field of fire like that, and I think that officer hopefully was punished for that. But at the same time, so what we need is, when it comes to our trucker protest, I think Tara's right. There were people who wanted to make an assumption, and they were basing their fear on an assumption that perhaps was, I think the facts it turned it up being was quite unfounded.
Well, similar to protesters who want to get their fix, there are some police officers, obviously, too, that think, okay, this is, I get to flex my muscles here. And, they also get an adrenaline rush being in the front of that line with a riot shield in their hands.
Yeah, power, baby, power.
Power, baby, power. Okay, you guys mentioned the convoy. I want to get into this. I'll call this section My Maple Leaf. We've been sitting on this CBC story for a while, but I finally want to release it again into the world because we're approaching Canada Day. Look at that beautiful flag in front of us. But don't be hurt, Peter and Tara, as you look upon this flag. I know seeing it might hurt parts of you because it was the same flag that was found outside the Parliament buildings when they were blocked by trucks for many weeks. At least that's the story being told by this CBC piece, which has the headline, "Years After the Convoy, Ottawa Residents Are Reclaiming the Canadian Flag." Subtitle, "Some Ottawans Say the Flag's Meaning Was Twisted by Use During Freedom Convoy." Interviewing people in Ottawa who say this was a dark period in Ottawa's history. One man choking up thinking about it. They twisted it into this dark and evil and wrong thing. One had a visceral reaction to seeing a Canadian flag after the convoy. "We are pleased that the flag is back to where it should be," another says. Tara, what did you make of this story? The way it's written, the people that they spoke to in it, what the heck?
I mean, there's a couple of things to note here. I think it's worth referring to Paul Rouleau, who wrote the Public Order Emergency Commission report, who noted that while the truckers may have been spreaders of false information on some instances, they were also the victims of that. And that when there was, so-called misinformation in the press about the truckers, that it was amplified a lot. And one of the examples that Rouleau points to in that report is the attempted arson, the apartment arson, and how the Ottawa police later confirmed that had no connection at all to demonstrators. And so there was, I think, some, reporting that was hysterical, that was drumming up fear, that was certainly not fact-based, and that created an environment that was really hysterical. I'm just going to read you one headline from CTV News. Calling Ottawa protests peaceful downplays non-violent dangers, critics say. So this piece that you've just noted from CBC, I see it as a piece of all of that coverage. It's not balanced. It's not even particularly rational. The expert that is quoted in that piece talks about how the convoy were nationalists who wanted to decide who was Canadian and who was not Canadian. That is not the impression that I got from, following the commission and following the news reporting from independent outlets. You saw the Sikh truckers, for example, being widely celebrated. So I just think, I think that we would benefit in Canada from having a retrospective look at this coverage. And now with so much more information come to light with both the POEC Commission and also the federal court ruling that found the invocation of the Emergencies Act illegal, I think it's really time for us to go back and see how this reporting holds up. And I suspect it's not very well.
This is the thing. We so seldomly go back and right wrongs and get a sense of things and learn from things. This is sad in that it seems like, this is, again, a bookend to an event. And it's like, what have we learned? I don't think anyone should be able to decide who's Canadian or not. People use symbols as they want to. And, one of the most frustrating things I hear from politicians of all sides is, Canadians are this or Canadians aren't that. Canadians don't like this. It's like, God, Peter, what did you make of the coverage and the people that they spoke to or didn't speak to in this piece?
I think Tara pretty much covered all of that. I was looking at it again and thinking, okay, like Canada Day's coming up. Should I mark myself safe on Facebook, right? Because I'm safe from the trauma of somebody wrapping themselves in the flag I think is my flag, right? People wrap themselves in the flag because they want to show generally that they belong. Right. People protest sometimes because they're feeling excluded in society. Something has happened to make them feel excluded. So they take that flag and it's a symbol. The fact that, you could do that story so many ways. You could actually say, what is wrong with people who, when they see that happen, are not rational enough to say, well, that's how they use it. This is how I use it. It means this to me. It means that to them. Whatever. But to go back and do a story, that repeated what many people would consider to be a false impression, or at least an overwrought impression. Obviously, if you have horns honking all night and that sort of stuff, it's unpleasant.
Yeah, right? Let's not take away from the fact that some of these people are, wound up in criminal proceedings and all this stuff. This is separate. This is a weird, insecurity and fear.
There's a real deal there, but like the expert quoted and that sort of stuff. But I guess trying to also get to what you said, Harrison, is journalism isn't very good at revisiting itself. And we could maybe talk about that some more later, but going back and saying, did we get that right? If we were to do that again, what can we learn from this? Did we just always find the most extreme statement and broadcast that? And what is the impact of that? Are we in fact spreading misinformation? Everybody talks about misinformation coming from Rebel News and others, and they're not necessarily wrong about that. But what are they doing themselves to spread misinformation? And then you spread that misinformation, and then you've got these people overreacting, and you've got traumas and blah, 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 blah. Oh, now I need to go see like a psychotherapist or something.
Peter, we're like golden retrievers chasing a ball that is the story, and you're constantly moving forward, and our memories are very short, and you're never revisiting what was I just doing 10 seconds ago? Maybe we're more like goldfishes. Just so people don't think this is niche, I won't name names, but a prominent anchor here in Toronto described this to me before this article was read to me. After the convoy, she said, I was at home and someone had a Canadian flag outside their door, and she viscerally felt like hurt and like it wasn't her flag anymore. And it's like, these are the people reading you the news. we're very sensitive at times. It also may come from the fact, and I don't want to get too academic-y here, but the Liberal Party and the left here in Canada does theoretically, it created a lot of the national symbols here in this country, whether they be the flag, the Constitution. They were in power when "O Canada" became our national anthem. So maybe, Tara, that's behind some of this. Where does this sensitivity and ownership weirdness come from?
I'm not really sure. But I would like this Canada Day for us to have a little more unity. And I think we've been seeing movements towards that in reaction to the American tariffs. And I think that that's a hopeful sign. I mean, I think it's a wonderful country, and it's, I think, a good time to celebrate it, and to celebrate it with everyone living here. And I think that that's a good message for right now.
Let's all come together, people. There's been too much division. Rally around the flag, etc. Okay, I'm going to call this section, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" Because, like I said, Brother Menzies is not happy because even though private journalistic outlets continue to get subsidies and now have a government in power who will continue to fund said subsidies, there is another call for subsidies. Peter, can you explain what form that is taking?
Yes, it came in the form of an op-ed by Paul Deegan of News Media Canada, basically calling upon the government to do what the government of Ontario did when Doug Ford decided to dedicate a percentage, I believe it was 25%, of provincial advertising spend, that it must be spent on Ontario-based publishers to that extent. And now Deegan has taken that. They've been taking that to other provinces and not found much success so far, but they're taking it back now to a new prime minister and a new PMO and saying what we need, if you really believe in us, and because we're defenders of democracy, as we talk about every week, you should be spending this same percentage of dedicating it to
the feds
of your advertising to our pages, for the feds to do the same. So essentially, when you're asking for somebody to spend money where the business case doesn't justify it being spent, you're asking for a subsidy. Mm-hmm. And as long as people keep saying yes, and it's fun to say yes, I think, to media, because they kind of owe you, right, when you do that. This is going to continthat.
But Peter, he says it's not a subsidy. His argument in the piece is the money's already going to be spent.
I know he says it's not a subsidy, but that I strongly disagree. If the money is for advertising, you place advertising where you get the most reader response. If that is not the Aurelia Times or the Daily Bugle, then it isn't. If it is, then you should be putting the advertising there, right? So if you have an audience, if you have eyeballs, if you are producing content that serves the reader, you will get eyeballs and you will get advertising. But you don't, you're not going to get any extra eyeballs because you've got a Government of Canada ad telling you, where to apply for a passport. People go online for that. This, it's the 21st century. Right?
Just so people understand, these are ads around, here in Ontario that you'll see in news outlets here in Ontario. The LCBO, cannabis dispensaries, Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation, Metrolinx, which is third party involved in a lot of transportation planning here. Tara, what did you make of this? He says in the op-ed, this is about safeguarding our sovereignty. You can see a lot of industries now leaning on this idea in the face of Trump tariffs that you need to batten down the hatches, and the hatches should have maple leafs on them. What do you make of this?
Well, I do think we need a strong, robust media. I do not think we're going to get there through more government involvement. I just don't. I think we're losing this argument, and
or we've lost it. I don't know.
Yes, But I just want to refer back. There was a commission, and Peter will remember the name of it because it's escaping my mind right now. Was it in the 80s? Anyways, the news leaders came to that commission and said, get the heck out of our newsrooms. Like, I don't think government and media should have links in that way. I don't think it's healthy for us. And our biggest problem right now is public trust. And again, I sound like a broken record on this, but I don't think it's healthy for public trust.
Just as an example, 5 years ago,
Thank you.
5 years ago, the former New York City mayor, Bill de Blasio, mandated that city agencies allocate at least 50%, that's double what we've just been talking about, of their print and digital advertising to community and ethnic media. Just lastly, Peter, because the pushback to this would be, of all the subsidies, this is the least egregious, but you're not buying it.
No, I'm not. And I think I think it actually makes it worse, because if something isn't working, you don't subsidize that, right? If you're going to subsidize anything, you give some grub stake money to what could work, or what you think could work, or what is working, right? You incentivize excellence rather than sort of go back and say, well, here we are, like if you support in order to support sovereignty, you have to subsidize our product, right? Like, that makes the whole thing is backwards, right? Like I've written before, if you're going to subsidize anything, you subsidize consumption. And if people aren't inspired to consume a product, then they won't consume it, and they will go to one that they are inspired to consume. So subsidizing failure is no way to win.
It's a good way to end it. Okay, I'll do a little intro here, and Peter will leave us with this, and we'll get Tara's take too. We have a bouquet this week for a Canadian, because we're feeling so nationalistic in the lead up to Canada Day. Housing Minister Gregor Robertson, apparently, according to Breaker News, out where Peter is in BC, has at least 3 what critics would call investment properties. A Vancouver penthouse worth $2.4 million, a Tofino house $2.85 million, and then undisclosed interest in a lakeside property in Squamish, BC, worth $5.6 million. Someone who's very good at math could put those together and find a very large amount of money. But Peter, you wanted to award the folks over at Breaker News for, what did they do with these numbers?
Really, the folk. It's like a one-man shop, Bob
Oh, really?
Macklin at Breaker News. Yeah. He has a website and a Substack, and he does some good work. He's an experienced reporter. So what happens is the Conservatives ask a question in the House. Blacklock's, which is another sort of mom and pop shop that breaks a lot of stories, they report on it fairly exclusively. But the Conservative question of Gregor Robertson's fairly vague. What properties do you own? He doesn't disclose. And so Macklin takes a look at that and says, I'm going to go find out, which is what journalists should do. And he went and found out and checked provincial records, and he got the detail on the minister's real estate holdings, which are understood to be undisclosed in his filings to the ethics commissioner, which is a little awkward. So bouquets, flowers to Bob Macklin at Breaker News, the Breaker News, for doing what journalists should do and asking questions and digging.
Tara, you're our fellow Vancouverite. What did you make of
Yes.
this story and what was discovered?
Ooh. There's a lot I could say about this. I am from Vancouver. I did watch my hometown become so astronomically expensive that most of the people I know cannot afford to live there. And this did happen during Gregor Robertson's years. There were a lot of factors, but this is the time period that we're talking about. And there's something that I covered this a little bit in my first book. I had a whole chapter on the housing crisis in Vancouver, and it is a very complicated story, but it's also quite infuriating one. And one of the points that myself and others made at that time was that the decision makers that were involved all owned property. And this was not small amounts of money. We're not talking about a $300,000 house or a $600,000 house or even a $1 million house. This is Vancouver real estate. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars in investments. And why that is not considered a conflict of interest is absolutely beyond me. So I'm very happy to see this being dug into.
So are they not supposed to own houses? Like what's fair in your mind, guys, in terms of, if you're a politician basically challenging this, and it is a crisis objectively, what should you not have or have in terms of housing?
Well, at the very least, you should be disclosing it all.
Yes,
at the very, very least, because then the public can decide for themselves.
Yeah, that's fair.
Exactly. I mean, disclosure is the first thing, being honest about it. I mean, why wouldn't you disclose it? I mean, I forgot about $11 million worth of my investments. Sorry. That's a little tough. And particularly when you're housing minister and you're out there saying, no, look, our aim isn't to bring housing prices down. Well, no wonder you don't want to bring housing prices down, because you don't just have a home, right? And that's where, like Tara's point is, it's one thing if you live in Vancouver, like the place I'm sitting in right now is worth twice as much as the guy who paid for it. That's not his fault. But this is his home, right? And that's your home. So you can't blame people for that. But when you've got a penthouse condo over here, and you've got a place in Tofino over there, and you've got another property, these are likely or possibly revenue properties, well, I don't know. Like maybe the public can decide, or the PMO can take a look at that and say, how does that go to your credibility when you're trying to deal with housing prices? Because if you bring them down by 20%, you lose $2 million.
All right, I'm going to leave you two to return to your homes and enjoy the rest of your week. That is Full Press for this week. You can join us in 2 weeks again, 2 Thursdays from now. Thank you so much for listening to us this week. Happy Canada Day, because I think our next episode will come out after. Be well, everyone.
Stay safe.
Stay safe mentally and physically.